Hi, it's Alistair McIntyre at Electric Scotland. I'm bringing this video, it's really about Scottish independence, because it's a long time since I did anything on independence. And it's just that someone made a point to me the other day which I thought was made a lot of sense. I mean, basically what they said to me is, you know, Alistair, no country in the world can be independent anymore, because we're governed by such a big hierarchy in the world. You say, for example, you know, the UK is in the EU, so we have to obey EU laws because they take precedence over the UK. But in turn, the WTO, World Trade Organization, they take precedent over the EU. So if they impose laws, the EU must follow them. And you've got the UN, which is right at the very top of the hierarchy. We've all got to obey other laws. And of course, I thought, well, yeah, that's a valid point. And of course, the more I thought about it, I thought, well, there's an example. Like, for example, the SNP wanted the named persons scheme to go through. And they passed it in Parliament, as I understand, but it was appealed to the Supreme Court of Scotland. And the Supreme Court of Scotland decided that, no, it was okay to go ahead with that. So the people protesting it took it to the UK Supreme Court because they have precedence over the Scottish court, so they hoped they would overturn it there. Now, in fact, they did overturn it, but not because of the UK laws, it was actually because of EU laws, because it infringed the human rights. And under the EU Charter of Human Rights, the named person scheme would be illegal. And of course, since then, it's been thrown back to Scotland for them to decide what to do with it, and they still haven't been able to come up with wording that would satisfy the European human rights laws. So I think that's a very good example of where an independent country wants to do something but finds it can't because there's someone higher up the chain that won't allow it. Now, I would also say that Canada and the USA are a bit similar in a lot of ways to Scotland and the rest of the UK. But if you look at, like, there's been a long-running battle between the US and Canada about softwood lumber. Now, basically, America, or the pressure group there, doesn't want cheap Canadian lumber coming in to the US and therefore affecting their sales. So they persuade the US government to put big tariffs on Canadian lumber. But the Canadians don't accept that, and they go to the World Trade Organization to appeal the decision. And what happens? The WTO basically overturned it, so now the US has to repay those tariffs that they imposed on Canada and do away with the increased tariffs. But of course, the US, being who they are, they then give it a little time and then they impose a new tariff for a slightly different reasons. So Canada goes back to the WTO and eventually we win again at the WTO and America has to pay back the money. But the problem with that is that every time that goes through, it impacts the actual softwood lumber businesses, mostly in BC, I will say, in British Columbia. And that means they have to lay off staff and all kinds of things while it's going on, because clearly because of the tariffs, they can know that their softwood lumber becomes more expensive. Therefore, no one wants to buy it in America at that more expensive rate. So they have real problems in their business. So while we overcome it, it might be 2 years before we win the case. And some companies just can't last that long and literally go out of business. And of course that's the idea of the running in the long run. American inks eventually will cause a big eruption in their industry in Canada, so it'll no longer be a problem for us. And you could say that Canada and America are best of friends really at the end of the day. When it comes to business, there are no friendships. There's almost, well, we let you away with it because you're a good friend. It doesn't work that way. And so I just wanted to kind of make that point, that even though we might be independent and out with Westminster's control, we're always within someone else's control. And again, if you look at the EU statutes, many of the laws they come out with on trade and tariffs and everything, if you actually look at a lot of these laws, they're almost verbatim what the WTO has imposed on the world. And therefore the EU has to change their laws to basically come into line with the WTO laws, because the WTO will always overcap the EU laws. So I really just wanted to kind of make those points. But I think the other point is that while maybe emotionally we want to be independent, I still think there's issues that we have with independence. I mean, one of the problems I find is that the only decent figures we have to date in Scotland is the GERS report. And while the GERS report makes great reading for Scotland, people love it and quote it all the time. But if we don't like the new GERS report because it says Scotland's not doing very well, then of course people don't like that, and they will start to spin stories about how they're not really very accurate and they get this wrong and that wrong. But at the end of the day, there's the only set of figures that we can reasonably rely on, because they work to world standards for statistics. And therefore you cannot get more accurate figures. If you want more accurate figures, you're going to have to come out with a range of reports that every business must submit. And one of the problems with things like that is that could cause some companies a whole pile of issues and problems. They might have to employ an extra person to do the work. And in the end, they might decide it's just not worth it. And maybe they'll fudge figures or something like that. But if they're going to do them accurately, it could be a huge amount of work. And they're not being paid to produce those figures. They've got to do it out of their own income. So it might be that you get to the point where someone says, let's just move to England. We can still do all our business. We won't have to fill in all these bloody extra reports that the Scottish Government's asking to fill in. I mean, you seem to think that if you want something, you must get it. But there's other people out there that say, well, I've got to do the work to give you these figures. Why don't you pay me to produce the figures? Then I'll happily do it. If you pay me, but if you want me to do it for nothing, you pay it. Because we're not going to do it for nothing. We ain't a charity after all. And that's where I think this discussion on GERS is the best we've got. And if you want better figures, then it needs more reports. That's going to be funded somehow. Otherwise, you're just going to piss businesses off and they'll leave and go to England. The trouble with the UK is we all speak English. And so it's easy to move to England. If you're in Denmark or Norway or Sweden, they all speak different languages. And so if someone speaks a foreign language, going to that other country is not as easy. But moving down to England is a piece of cake. There's no problems at all doing that. So you have to be a little careful about what you impose on businesses. And then there's figures. I mean, for example, I've been doing a little bit of research. Admittedly, to give a better picture, you need a whole lot of research being done. But there is a site where you can actually get ideas of taxation from the Scandinavian countries. Now, I'll put a link to that site out of interest at the bottom of this video in the descriptions. But going there, I find, for example, that they're much higher taxed. Well, Norway isn't, but certainly Sweden and Denmark are much higher tax rates. Because the only way, I mean, I'll quote from a little bit, it basically says that they tax most people at these high rates, not just high income taxpayers. The top marginal tax rate of 60% in Denmark applies to all income over 1.2 times the average income in Denmark. You know, it isn't a mistake that taxes in Scandinavia countries are structured this way. In order to raise a significant amount of revenue, the tax base has to be broad. This means higher taxes on consumption through VAT and higher taxes on middle income taxpayers through high payroll taxes. And in all three of those Scandinavian countries, the VAT rate is at 25%. In the UK, it's 20%. But the problem with VAT in particular is it hits the lowest paid people the hardest. And that's not good, because we've already got massive income gaps all over the place. And the poor are getting poorer in Scotland. We need to fix that. Now, you know, I mean, if you think about what that means, I mean, like our tax rates are, if you can earn up to 11,500 and pay no tax. From 11,501 to 43,000, you pay 20%. But if we were in Denmark, that means the last 10,000 of that would be paid at 60% rather than 20%. That's a huge jump. Then if you go to the higher rate, and this is not the highest rate we have in Scotland, but the higher rate is 43,001 to 150,000, of which we currently pay 40%. But in Denmark, you would pay 60% on all of that. These are major taxes. Now, I have to say, there doesn't seem to be a lot of people queuing up in these countries to leave, but as I've said before, it's actually a lot easier to leave to go to England than it would ever be to leave to go to another country that speaks a different language. So that's the danger of putting tax up. I don't actually know the level of benefits Scandinavian countries get as a result of those much higher taxes, and that's why some research would need to go into it. But again, if we're going to fix the problems we have, because remember, if we go independent, we'll lose the Barnett formula. Barnett formula currently gives us an average about 8 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And don't forget, the Barnett formula is worked out on the basis of population, and it's worked out also based on the devolved powers and so forth. So you'll get so much for health, so much for the education system, so much for justice, and so much for other things. And basically they tot it all up, and it becomes a lump sum which they give to the Scottish Government. Scottish Government then can decide themselves how they want to split that up. They needn't split it up on the way they received it, because they just get a block sum. So they can spend less on health if they feel it's right to spend more on education. That's for the Scottish Government to decide. But we get that money, and if we left, we've got to fill that gap. And again, I'll give you another link to like a Chocoblog, which explores some of these cost structures and how are we going to get the money, fill the gap between that money. Now I'll tell you, one of the ways is that if we did split up, we could deal with England under WTO terms. Which I might add is, I mean, you should be really looking at Brexit, because I can tell you a split between Scotland and the rest of the UK, in my view, is going to be Brexit times 10. So while you might be amused at the Brexit negotiations, just think, everyone's going to be amused at Scotland and the rest of the UK arguing about their Brexit. It can be very amusing. But the thing is, if we dealt with WTO terms, but we're also going to have our own currency, because the SNP have decided that not having their own currency was one of the big reasons they lost the referendum. So next time round they'll have their own currency. A currency will float, it will clearly be weaker than the pound, weaker than other currencies. So as the UK is getting the benefit of a lower currency at the moment, on major increases in exports and everything, of far more tourists coming in, Scotland could then enjoy a similar benefit. Obviously our imports would go up, but you know, we could actually do quite well on that basis. So, but again, we need to look at those kind of things. The other thing is that at the end of the day, right now, we are paying quite a lot of money on public services. For example, the difference in earnings between people working in the public and private sector in Scotland is actually higher than the UK average. The median pay in Scotland for public workers is £16.06 per hour, whereas the private sector gets £12.16 per hour. So that's almost £4 an hour of a difference between public servants get, or public workers get, and private workers get, which is part of the reason for there being a pay cap for public sector workers. Because public sector workers have to be paid out of the money we generate in Scotland, because it's a public service, hence our tax money goes to pay those higher wages to the public sector. Is that fair? The lower paid private sector having to fund the much higher paid public sector workers? I think maybe some people might start to think about that a wee bit. But if you want to know what that means, it basically means that if you look at the tax rates we got at the moment, like you can earn up to 11,500 and pay no tax in Scotland. The basic rate of tax is from 11,501 to 43,000. And for that we pay 20%. But if we were in Denmark, for example, then the last 10,000 of that, in other words 33,000, would have to go to 60%. So for the last 10,000, instead of paying 20%, we'd be paying 60% in tax. And then the higher rate at the moment is from 43,001 to 150,000. We currently pay 40%, but if we were in Denmark, we'd be paying 60% on that. So these are not small sums of money. But again, if you're going to pay for public services, you need that kind of money coming in, and it can only come from higher taxation. And don't forget, as far as VAT goes, all these 3 Scandinavian countries I quoted, they all have a VAT rate of 25%, whereas in the UK we have 20%. So we probably have to increase VAT as well as these tax rates and bans. So none of this is going to come cheap to us. And as I say, people keep thinking, oh, we'll save a pile on defence, but I think someone's calculated that, I'm trying to remember the figure now, but someone said we might save, I think, 500 million or something like that. But I mean, we're talking about 8 billion here, so that's not much of a dent by saving on defence. And the other thing is that, you know, at the end of the day, if we're in NATO, we have to pay to NATO, because we'd have to invest 2% to be in NATO, because Donald Trump's already said he's not subsidising NATO any longer. You want NATO, you pay 2% of GDP. So 2% of GDP would have to go to NATO if we remained in NATO. Now we could come out of NATO, which I would suspect would cause some problems and issues for us, but nevertheless that's the case. Now, I would like to know why people think we should be independent, apart from on an emotional level. They think Scotland could be much better if we were independent. I'd like to know how we'd be better. Because I say, if you've got an 8 billion gap that you have to fill, we somehow have to get that 8 billion back, and it doesn't look like we're going to get it out of taxes unless we up the taxes to the Denmark level. And would that be acceptable to the Scottish people? I don't know. But if we wanted to get into the EU GDP ratio is 3%. And almost most countries in the EU stick to the 3%. The couple that don't and went way over the top, you know, were threatened with very heavy penalties. And they had to put systems in place to retrench back. I think Spain's almost got there. I think last time I looked, Portugal was still about 5%, but coming down to the 3%. So if we joined the EU, we would have to have programmes in place and enforce them and show that we were doing so to get down to the 3%. And that means, I'm sorry, but it means tax increases, VAT, I mean, it means all kinds of things, because we can't sustain the level of debt we've got. And we've got much higher debt than any other country in the EU. I mean, politically, you might get away with something, but you've got to bear in mind that Scotland's only going to be 1% of the population of Europe. 1%. I mean, that's nothing. People can afford to ignore us. But if your ego is so that we're Scottish, therefore we've got to be the best, I'm sorry, there's a lot of people who don't even look at Scotland. Don't even consider us as being worth even looking at. And the world moves on. There's a total ton of people in the world who never even heard of Scotland, for Pete's sake. You know. So, I mean, don't think because we're nice to be Scotland that they're going to be treated nice by everyone. At the end of the day, countries have to defend themselves. And why should they give Scotland the rise if it's going to affect them? Those of them say, well, we like you, but no, sorry, it won't happen. So I think we need I mean, the problem I've got here is that I think Nicola Sturgeon is a poor excuse for a First Minister. She's a whiner. She whines all the time. I got to the point where if I hear her talking, I just switch off. I can't stand to hear her because it's always someone else's fault. Always someone else's fault. Never her fault. She's never willing to take any responsibility for anything. She should go. But the problem is, because of the SNP system, that everyone has to speak with a common voice, it means that we don't know if we've got any SNP NSPs that could be capable of taking over from her. Because none of them stand out because they're not allowed to speak other than the common speech of the SNP. Who? I mean, Morrisshire, for example, they decided that they didn't like Alex Salmond, and was it Alec Robertson or whatever his name is that was the lead MP down at Westminster for the SNP. They both had big majorities and they both lost because Morrisshire decided they'd had enough, that these MPs weren't representing them, and so they turfed them. And I also have to ask you the question, if 52% voted to leave and 48% voted to remain, so we got independence, who's to say that Auckland and Shetland might not turn around and say, hey, enough, 65% of us voted to remain, so, you know, you've got to respect our decision, I'm sorry, but we're going to stick with the rest of the UK. Maybe Morrisshire would do the same. Look, we voted big time to stick with the rest of the UK, so sorry, we're not going to come into an independent Scotland. Forget it. Oh, that might happen. That's the trouble. When you start going that route, all things are off the bench. Things can happen. So I think you want to start looking, be more sensible at global matters. You know, would we really be independent? I mean, 25% of SNP voters voted to leave the EU. 25% of them voted to leave. Because they saw, what's the point in getting out from under Westminster and going under Brussels? Brussels is far more divorced from us. And we'd only be 1%, whereas at least here we're 10%. And we have a bit more influence because the number of MPs we have. And the Brussels don't speak our language. Go to Belgium, there's 6 languages there. I think English is probably the 4th spoken language there in Belgium. I've been in Belgium, I know. So, you know, I think you've got to think about this. Can we genuinely be an independent country? And the answer actually is no, we can't. There's so much going on in the world that trump all our individual freedoms in a country. And if we try and change something, we're going to find that we can't sell our products. I mean, this idea of getting what was it they call it? Getting a power grab from the Brexit negotiations. The thing is, if you look through a lot of that, there's a lot of common sense in having common standards in the UK. For example, food labelling. If we decide arbitrarily to change the food labelling system in Scotland, then automatically the products wouldn't be able, you couldn't sell them in the EU. And you couldn't maybe sell them to other countries of the world because your labelling no longer has the standards that are required by the World Trade Organization. So, you know, you can't arbitrarily change things just because you want to. So you have to look at these areas, and don't take my word for any of this. You need to go out there and research it yourself. And I'll make one further point. Those people that don't believe jurors, they need to come out of hiding and admit they're liars, because they are liars and con artists and cheats. If you want better statistics, you tell us how you're going to get them and where they're going to come from. Because right now, the only figures we've got that we can in any shape or form trust are the jurors' figures. End of fucking story. Sorry, I'm swearing, but end of story. These are the only figures we can trust right now. There are no other figures from anywhere else that will give us a better view of how Scotland's economy is working. You want better figures that you seem to trust? They have to be world standards, because the jurors' figures are world statistical standards. Tried and tested, so the rest of the world trust them because of the standards that they're produced to. So if you query them, you're querying them out of pure ignorance or deceit. One or the other, ignorance or deceit. Both are unacceptable in people that are talking about policy. So, think about independence. We cannot be an independent country because we're subject to global laws. So we can never be truly independent. So why do you want to be independent from England, who is basically our largest export market? We sell far more to England, then we sell more to the US, and only third becomes the rest of the European Union. So if anything, we should be wanting the UK to get the best possible Brexit deal it can. And why should we spend 50 billion to pay to the EU when we can spend that 50 billion here in the UK? And 5 billion of that would come to Scotland. 5 billion is a lot of money. So why are you prepared to say, I don't want the 5 billion, I'd rather you paid that to the EU, please? Makes no sense at all. So let's find if we can get someone new, get Sturgeon out, because she obviously hasn't got a viable thought in her head, and obviously the people that she's trusting to give her advice are letting her down badly, and she doesn't seem to recognise that. Hence her education system, our health system, our justice systems are all under major pressure. We've got to fix these problems. We can only fix it by thinking better. But I say, who in the SNP could take over? They're all clones of everyone else. They say the same things. Ask one, they'll give you the same answer. But that doesn't mean that we learn anything about these people. They're clearly incapable of making a clear decision. That's why they joined the SNP. They don't need to think if they're in the SNP, because the SNP tells them how to think and what to say under any scenarios. So, you know, you may as well put a computer in there. They'll do just the same job as an SNP MSP. Ridiculous. So, I'd like us to wake up, and I'd like us to get involved in Britain again and really take Britain forward. Because I think the better Britain does, the better Scotland will do. And that's the future. And don't forget, there's at least 50,000 barrels of oil, or 50 million barrels of oil down in England that we can use sometime in the future. Okay, that's my kind of little rant, but it was done with a point, that someone made a point, that no country can be independent in the world these days with all the global situations going on. So I just thought that was important to point out, and I hope you'll think about that, and certainly come back to me. I mean, I have no problems in discussions on anything else. No problems at all. So, let me hear from you. Thanks.